Hi, thank you for joining the second event of the SSSH Saigon Social Sciences Hub 2025 spring session. It's great to have so many of you online today. For those who are not familiar, I sent you a few links in the chat. Today, I am very pleased to introduce to you our speaker, Patrick Slack, PhD candidate in geography in McGill University. I won't be too long, and I will now leave the floor to Patrick for a presentation entitled Navigating Multi-Cited Method, Disciplinary Longitudinal Research, 140 Years of Commoditisation in two Highlands, Northern Borderland districts. Um, Please kindly make sure to turn off your microphones for our speaker to stay focused. Patrick, thank you so much for your participation today. You can go ahead. You have 30 to 40 minutes. We are all here. Thank you.
Thanks, Leo. And you reading my title made me realize I should maybe shorten it so you don't have to take in a breath in the middle. But yeah, so thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Patrick Slack, and I'll just go ahead and dig right in. So just a little bit about me. I'm currently a PhD candidate in geography at McGill University, working with Sarah Turner and Jean Michaud. And how did I get here? I first did a bachelor's of science in agronomy, and I worked in Laos at an internship for a little bit, and I became interested in conservation and ethnic minority livelihoods and justice. And so I came to McGill hoping to build off of that. And so where I first entered was doing my master's also at McGill in geography with a thesis titled Rolling the Dice with Spice. And this dissertation was about cardamom diversification over the last about 30 years at the time. And that sort of was the impetus for where I got interested in where and what I'm working on today. And so I'm just going to give a brief outline. I want to sort of disclose how I got to my topic. I want to introduce my topic. I want to discuss a little bit about theory, tell you about my methods, and get through my results as well. And then also I have a few discussion points at the end. I want this to be mainly a broad talk where I'm laying a bunch of like a smorgasbord, laying a bunch of different little pieces out. And if we want to engage with them in the question and answer, that's great. But I just want it to be a sort of sampling of what I've been doing over the last several years. And hopefully that can contribute to what you're working on. So I originally did my master's on cardamom cultivation in Batsat district, which I'll introduce in a little bit. But after that, I became really interested in doing a cross-border cardamom comparative study. I was thinking maybe I could do a little bit in Vietnam, a little bit in Laos, a little bit in China, just trying to understand how are these different places working with their cardamom cultivations and their cultivators, and are there any differences in how people navigate their livelihoods in between? Well, COVID-19 happened. That wasn't going to happen. And so I pivoted a little bit. And with the help of a committee member, Jean Michaud, he happily shared archival material from UNOM and from the AFAO school in Paris. And these were a really dense set of data that I'll talk about in a little bit. But basically, I was hoping that I could maybe do a comparative study of livelihoods at the turn of the 1900s and then within living memory. So yeah, so I was hoping to do, I really like comparisons. I guess that's maybe a geography thing, or maybe just my own thing, but I've always been curious about how things differ in that regard. Well, I looked for files in Center Number 1 in Hanoi. and I was in my fieldwork site and I broke my ankle. So I returned home for surgery, and that didn't really work. So then I pivoted again, um, and I decided to focus more on archival material and sort of change my comparison aspect of before and after. And I rather tried to compose a continuous sort of change of study, which has had its own complications. But if anything, there's a lot of really rich data out there for rural agrarian livelihoods in the archives. And that's what I have become super interested in. And that's just a reiteration of something that I found to be very important, which is that all of these things have to be flexible and contingent upon who you meet in the field and how you can get your permissions and how you can get access to the archives. But it's also pushed me to look at things in a different regard, and work on things conceptually that I hadn't originally planned either. Yeah. So to introduce my topic. So this is where I worked. This is Phong To district in Lai Châu province and Bat Sat district in Lao Cai province. And here there are three main upland ethnic minority groups: the Mien, also known as the Zhao due to a aged mistranslation in pronunciation, the Hmong, and the Hani. And so here, this is my research aim. Here is where I want to investigate how ethnic minority Mien, Hmong, and Hani farmers living in these two neighboring districts and provinces in the northern borderlands of Vietnam have maintained, reworked, or abandoned semi-subsistence livelihoods amidst noteworthy territorialization and enclosure processes in these uplands from 1883 until 2023. Now, I use some words, some terms here that I will explain in a little bit, but I just wanted to give you the broad sort of focus for my dissertation. And I'm guessing the first question might be, why here? Well, I'm interested in these two locations because they're, one, directly on the border. This is a map from, I believe, this is a map that Jean made that was supposed to be based in 1903, but basically they share the same military territory. And they also, it became a province, which I'll also discuss in a little bit, but they sort of shared the same administrative collection. They're both integrated economies with each other. They have the same sort of agroecological zones that are on the same mountain range. They're both about 100 square kilometers. And they also have roughly the same amount of Mien, Hmong, and Hani populations. So they're fairly similar in comparison. Okay. How did I investigate any of this? So again, I had some of those initial archives sent by my committee member, but I looked at the National Archives in Vietnam, mainly centers 1 and 3. Went to the library, the provincial library in Lao Cai, where there were some communist histories that had some really dense data. And then just to see if there was anything there at the Vietnam National Library, which had some places, had some interesting sources. I spent most of my archival time also in France at NX, at ANOM, at SHD. BNF has a range of many different sources that people can pull from that I found to be really useful. And then, of course, the AFAO. And lastly, I also went to some American archives. I went to the National Archive and Records Administration just outside DC, where they have a lot of old colonial military sort of records there. The Field Museum sponsored a nature expedition that you'll see some pictures from and then also the Library of Congress had some different material that I just wasn't really expecting to find a lot, but I figured I'd give it a try, and I found that that's actually been a decent method. And so in these archival files, these are sort of the things that I was looking for. I was looking for those reconnaissance surveys that I was talking about, which you can see a map of in the central bottom portion of the slide. There were economic reports, police frontier reports, commodity reports, different interventions that were imposed, forestry regulations. So all these things sort of help me to paint a composite picture of the interventions and also the livelihoods um, that were sort of happening there. And so these were my more contemporary based methods. So I had 9 months of field work in Vietnam, 6 months were in my field sites. The other 3 months, I spend a lot of time at Center Number One. Um, and here I spoke with farmers, that you can see in the bottom, doing semi-structured interviews also, some conversational interviews, oral histories, where we use photos as prompts to sort of generate some feedback or different responses. And then also in the top right, you can see I interviewed some government officials, mostly forestry officials, for a paper that came out last year, I think. Yeah, and also research assistants. I used research assistants while I was there. My Vietnamese is not great, but passable. Maybe that's debatable. Maybe one of my research assistants is here. She might debate that. But so I worked with a Kingman from Hanoi, who was essential to navigating bureaucratic interviews. And then I also worked with a Hmong woman who was essential for breaking sort of the divide, the language divide that I constantly face, especially in the Highlands where Vietnamese was not all that common. And so together, I sort of melded these contemporary methods and oral histories with these archival findings, sort of trying to see where they lined up, but also saw where there was friction. Yeah. And so just to give an idea of, since the whole talk is navigating these sort of things, I just wanted to lay out sort of how I approached where I stayed. So these little red dots you can see right here are all places that we slept overnight, just so that we could have a little bit of closer access to where people were. We frequented markets, which are the little yellow triangles, trying to make sure that we could make contact with people. And that's just a natural space for gathering in the uplands there. And here I was trying to speak with people that were different distances from China, different distances from infrastructure, different distances from markets, just to see sort of what sort of livelihood diversity is there. Am I capturing everything that's going on in these two districts? And I also tried to make sure that I had fairly representational proportions of Mien Hmong and Hani people, just to make sure that I could see where the similarities or differences may have lied. There are also people who were conducting their livelihood activities, and I could tell that, they were doing something different, such as visible livelihood difference like trade or tourism. Those are some very obvious things, but the more material commodity side of things, rather than services, were a little bit more difficult to find. But I tried to explore each one of these just to sort of get a grasp of how are things doing, how are people doing this, and why are they doing that? And also differences in financial wealth to see how they're leveraging their own position. And also, I took into account agroecological zones. And this map here, the darkest red point is 3,000 meters high. There's massive elevational difference here. And that's sort of something that I alluded to when I was introducing the field sites. There are a lot of different livelihood opportunities that people can take because of this agroecological differentiation or diversity. So again, I really wanted to get a full picture of what was happening in both of these districts. Okay, theory. I'm going to show you my conceptual framework briefly, just to show you the bodies of literature that I'm pulling from, not so much the concepts. I'll pull out key concepts that I'm working with in the slide after. But basically, what I want to show is that I'm pulling from political ecology literature, from borderland and frontier studies, agrarian change literature, and also using a sustainable livelihoods approach. So I'm trying to unite these, see how livelihoods are changing in these frontier zones and how people and different actors are sort of negotiating their resources. So key terms. One thing that I want to discuss is frontier ideation. So the idea of a frontier, something that is the outermost limit, but also a zone that's untapped for potential for ordering and extracting, so commodities, labor, land. I think this is particularly relevant in Vietnam, where we have things called difficult communes. Now that's based in poverty sort of measures, but I believe that it's also a matter of, mountainous, socioeconomically deprived areas as well. Territorialization. So territorialization is a spatial strategy or process of restructuring the economic and political power at the edges of a territory. Enclosure refers to the process of restricting and controlling land resources and livelihoods, typically by the state, but also by markets and other sort of power brokers, in a way that people are limited in their how they make their livelihood choices. Commodification. These are sort of the key changes from which a good or a service comes into the market, which I'll introduce in a little bit. And livelihoods. It's more than just economics. I don't have the time to really get into a livelihoods approach, but the importance of social capital and natural capital, physical capital, human capital. There's many different ways that households sort of navigate their wealth, but also their livelihood goals, and also deal with a lot of complicated processes such as interventions that are constantly changing. Yeah. Okay. So results, and I have broken this down into results in 4 periods. I'll briefly introduce like why I have it broken down in this range, but yeah, this periodization is essential to sort of my argument. So in 1883, Tonkin becomes a French protectorate, and this area is, known as a place that's, again, lawless, with bandits. There's revolts, there are rebellions, there's pirates that are sort of scrounging around. There's the Black Flags, famously. So there's a lot of things going on. I'll just touch that it was an area of a bit of chaos. And so after that, military territories were established in 1891. And then we have this period of sort of deep reconnaissance from 1897 until 1907. And so there's also the border delineation along 1891 and 1893. And during this time, it's all about information collection. It's all about understanding what are the exploitable commodities, who are the people that are living here, because they realized they didn't know. And they found that it was, the French authorities. And then French authorities also realized that in order to fully govern this area, they needed to understand the sort of socio-political circumstances. And so this became an ethnographic study, but it was really about leveraging their own political dominance and economic dominance. And so some of the main interventions here were the creation of military posts, which you can see in white in the distance. And so these posts were meant to mobilize troops, but also to stabilize commerce. And over this period, there's also pacification missions that were mostly against bandits and violent sort of pirates, but also people that were opposed to colonial rule. But in order to keep control, military posts and transportation infrastructure help to move these people, but also move these commodities. And these sort of military, political, economic goals are often all the same. It's about the movement, the facilitation, the security of trade and commerce. It also became a laboratory for cash crops. Um, so there were trials all over the place during this period as well. What can be grown here? What's profitable? Trying things like coffee, trying to grow different kind of fruits. But then there was the establishment of opium, alcohol, and salt monopolies. And so the state really tried to grip the sort of vices here, I guess less so salt, but they're essentials to many urbanites, but also a source of great profit. And so the whole goal that a lot of these authors write about is to make these borderland economies more productive. They want inland migration, they want goods, and they want profits. And so livelihoods at this time, from 1883 to 1907, mostly upland rice, mostly upland corn. And here, by upland rice and corn, I mean seed is scattered by hand in usually swidden plots. It's not the terrace sort of irrigation that we usually associate with highland areas. But there are some paddy fields. There's a bunch of animals. There's buffalo, pack horses, chickens, pigs, ducks. And people are also growing cotton and hemp, which you can also see being sold here at this little market. There were also some limited commodities. Pawu was one valuable piece of wood that was usually used for export to China. It doesn't rot. A lot of homes in Sao Paulo are made of this wood, big planks. And then there's also kuno, which is a root, a brown root that's used for dyeing clothes brown, but also a subsistence crop. But there's not a lot of market exchange that's visible or monetarily sort of substantial to these colonial authorities who are monitoring all these things because they want to sort of get a piece of the pie. There's also hunting and fishing. I just think this picture is amazing. This picture is in Batsat in the 1890s. But people are using their forest adjacent livelihoods for sustenance, for swiddening plots. They're making a living right here. And one common misconception about highland livelihoods that I found in my research is that it seems as if scholars have thought that Mian, Hmong, and honey farmers have always sort of grown opium. But here, there's actually an absence. So not only is there an absence, but there's a noted absence. So it's rather than just like nothing is written about opium in these surveys, there's notable absence or failure of cultivating opium. And I find that really interesting because this sort of suggests that the connection to the market via the French could have been the introduction of a cash crop commodity. Now, opium did exist before, but it was mostly at marketplaces and usually purchased by Hmong, Mian, and honey individuals for likely medicine. And why is opium a fitting crop for this area? It's ideal for labor calendars. It's ideal for swiddening agriculture. It's also ideal for crop rotations. Traditional use is medicine. There is, people told me that they used it instead of alcohol to, like shamans specifically, but also for hospitality, to be a good host, offer them some opium, and also as financial capital. There were some accounts of addiction later on, but not as much, especially in these early days. And interestingly, it has to be grown above 1,500 meters. So that map that I showed of elevations, there's only a small amount of areas that can grow, that can have opium cultivated there. And what's also really valuable is because of rugged transportation, um, it's relatively non-perishable. It's high value, and yes, addiction is a problem, but this is a high value transportable good that can make it to the low end. And that is a part of why it's been such a um, key livelihood strategy in this area. Okay, so next period, 1907 to 1954. So 1907 marks Laokai, or the Fourth Military Territory, becoming Laokai Province, which means that it engaged more in civil matters, so commodity exploitation, rather than security and troop mobilization and such. And so here, infrastructure became a key focus. And with infrastructure came market intensification. The French during this period, were constantly looking to make more profitable commodities, make these areas more profitable. They wanted to facilitate commerce in a way that also drew in ethnic minority farmers as well. So this is where opium gets complicated here, because there's this ambiguous stance that, oh yes, like, people can grow opium, but we aren't going to say that it's okay to grow opium. So the state sort of loosely endorses opium as a strategy. And then there's this period of prohibition, of suppression, that seems to be more performative in the international relations of French colonies looking to be more appropriate managers of their subjects. The prohibition did not work. It was pretty much lip service. But this is a contentious thing that I'll also highlight in the next few periods. And opium was a large part of the French colonial budget, almost a fifth of the budget for almost 23 years. So this is a really important funder for the French colonial project. Other interventions included some forest protection, timber harvesting, and administrators despising swidden agriculture for burning vast plots. Okay, livelihoods during this period. So there's still subsistence. Opium is mostly traded informally. The monopoly is largely ignored. Prices in China are higher. Opium was the largest cash crop during this period. But there's also another one, which goes back to my own master's focus of black cardamom. Around the same time, 1910, both opium and cardamom became monitored and exploited more. It doesn't grow in the same range, but it grows from 1,000 to 1,500 meters. Again, it's a dried spice or medicinal commodity, and it's non-perishable, and it's predominantly sold in China. It's not as high priced as opium, but it's still substantial. And it's an unconventional source of accumulated wealth. And so usually people associate opium wealth with, upland livelihood wealth with opium, but here it's actually cardamom. So this picture was taken in 1931, and this Hani chief in Jingtuang said, "My people are rich. We have pigs and cardamom. We send them to Laokai City. If you'd come in the summer, you'd never seen us, but we come down from the mountains, but rarely, never in the summer when we must be at work." And so here he's boasting wealth about cardamom, and you can see there's quite a bit of silver here. And there's no mention of opium. And so this is an interesting finding because it does challenge opium being that really only source of wealth. And there's also some Kepomu or Samok, Cunningham, Lanceolata. I think it's a type of white pine. Again, these are also being exploited and exported to China, but less so important. Okay, so we have this period of 1907 and 1954, where there's market intensification. And now we have the rule of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam until 1993. And I'll explain 1993 later. But Democratic Republic of Vietnam officials chastised the French for using opium as a tool to exploit and enslave ethnic minority peoples. Constant language, even from Ho Chi Minh in 1945, how opium is just this evil that needs to be banned and forgiven so that people can move forward with socialist progress. But just as the French had difficulties with suppressing and banning opium and finding opium substitutes, the Democratic Republic and Socialist Republic of Vietnam also had the same difficulties. So this is just a couple of years before officially 1954, but throughout the North, Decision 150 was basically the same embodiment of the French monopolistic system for opium, where a quarter to a third was taxed. Growers couldn't sell anything informally. They had to report their amounts to state stores or MODIC. And so farmers, even then, still mostly informally traded opium. And at the same time, so you have this intensification of opium even more so after the French period. In the 1970s until the early 80s, there was the government-sponsored one plant opium sort of company where there's very little information on. But from what other scholars say, it's this sort of umbrella organization for purchasing and distributing opiates. And then it's not clear where that company really disassembles, and a nationwide purchasing policy for opium also takes hold. So from 1984 to 1987, you see the only period where opium cultivation is explicitly cultivated and people are asked to grow it. But farmers that I spoke to said that it was more like 1981 to 1991. Could this be a confusion between the two entities? Perhaps. But this is a booming time for where the most opium is grown, which is in 1986 and 1987 for Lao Cai and Lai Chou provinces. So again, farmers cultivated opium and sold it informally predominantly. They did sell it to state stores, but if you're going to get a better price or maybe something that you want, like a pig or a buffalo, then yeah, they traded for that more importantly. In the 1980s, this is a quote from a 69-year-old Hmong woman. In the 1980s, after the border war and before opium was banned, everyone grew so much opium. We grew it like rice and corn. From ET to Mung Hum, this is in Bat Sat district, opium flowers covered every hill. This is a constantly repeated sort of notion. People still continue to grow cardamom, but it was a little bit more difficult given the border war throughout the 1980s, so 1979 until I think 90, 91, where relations were normalized. There were about 6 years where people really did not cross the border, and then in the mid 80s, people started to cross the border and sell cardamom again. But this border restriction actually caused people to grow more opium because they couldn't sell their cardamom. So there's these interesting sort of commodity fluxes happening here. But opium wealth was highest at this point. And this is from a 62-year-old Hmong man. After the border war in the 1980s, it was a better time, sometimes even better than today. Everyone grew opium here. Hmong, Mian, Hani. We didn't bring money to the market. We just brought opium. We could have brought anything we wanted for 100 grams of opium, even salt for the whole year. Everyone was happy with their life. People didn't worry about anything. Sure, some people were addicts, but most people who smoked opium only smoked a little bit, not too much. After men smoked, we would help our wives make hemp fabric during the night. Everyone had the kind of meat we wanted, and we didn't worry about money or even our next meal. Our biggest worry was deciding what kind of food to eat because we had every food we wanted. We didn't need money, we only needed opium. Now, this is a really interesting quote because the comparison of difficulties today compared to back then, I find to be striking. Food security has been an issue. Food choice has been an issue since the 90s when opium was banned. But here he's making this big claim that he actually had more autonomy when opium was legal. I'm going to talk about a few other interventions before I go to the next period. But during Balcap, so the subsidy period, cooperatives were largely unsuccessful here. Really high taxes, 20 to 50%, low participation. In Batsat, there's a really weird existence of a wheat cooperative, which totally ignored upland livelihoods, totally ignored opium cultivation, rice, corn. It basically, also buckwheat was a huge subsistence crop back then, both for fodder, but also to feed families. And so these weird interventions just completely disregard local livelihoods and actually made them worse. They tried to give away the seed for free. Nobody wanted it, even to feed their cows or horses. So it's a big failure. Also, wheat was trying to replace opium cultivation amongst fava beans, corn, soybeans, potatoes. Nothing was as profitable. So there's really this issue of finding a replacement. Okay, 1993. So opium is banned. And despite having 80 years of trying to find a replacement, there's still no replacement that has been found. And you can see this is a picture from 2024. So people are still growing opium in these small plots. And now sort of different authorities like the Border Defense Force, public security, they're the ones that are in charge of looking at some of these border areas and finding these plots. But at the same time that opium is banned, land tenure is restricted, switching agriculture is restricted, and land tenure is privatized and exchangeable. So this is this exclosure that's enclosure that's happening, but exclusion of other people's livelihoods. And there's also afforestation, reforestation, forest conservation. There's a lot of things that really intensify during this period. And that creates this economic vacuum where there are these unprecedented cash demands of agricultural intensification for hybrid rice and corn, mechanization. You also have a government program called the New Countryside program that's pumping hundreds of millions, not billions, of Vietnamese dong into transportation infrastructure, market infrastructure, new homes. So there's this massive push for market integration, for cash demand, for cash generation. But people can't grow opium anymore. So people turn to cardamom, which can produce 840 to 2,800 US dollars a year. It's a crop that people are familiar with. It also preserves forest cover. It requires shade, full shade. So it seems to be this great alternative. But then extreme weather events happen and it ruins harvest, and there's more forest conservation. Lao Cai province is aiming to get rid of black cardamom altogether. So it's this really wild compounding series of results that are restricting and restricting and restricting. And as a result, you have people that are sort of going in all of these different ways. There's livestock intensification, there's wage labor, all the way to Saudi Arabia and North Africa, which I've not seen any other upland, I think like Mian or Hmong or Hani people doing. So a lot of silviculture, a lot of trading, a lot of tourism. This is where we are today. And in the essence of time, should I discuss some brief discussion points, or should I open it up? What do you think, Leo? Please? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, this is gradual, slow territorialization for the last 140 years. So these um, French colonial rule sort of embedded these extractive processes of infrastructure, opium monopolies, market integration, and they were continued for another nearly 40 years. Government initiatives aims to integrate these, not just these areas, but the livelihoods and the farmers via markets, via um, legible incomes, via market, via outposts, and I think I also see like government outposts sort of being the same sort of thing as military outposts. Um, so the DRV and the SRV regimes inherited and even extended these frameworks, which have had the result of further marginalizing some of these ethnic minority uh, uh, livelihood circumstances under the idea or the guise of poverty, of development, of sedentarization. But this hasn't been just broadly accepted. State-led reforms have constantly failed. People don't participate. People half-heartedly participate, or some people just, will accept it if they deem it acceptable. So they're embracing, they're modifying, they're resisting these policies, but their main goal is to survive and do what's best for their family and their goals. And so opium and cardamom have become the strategic choices that are rooted in their borderland geography and their informal markets that go across the border, but also within the border. And the state hasn't really been able to fully control it, although it is getting tighter and tighter. And my last point, enduring enclosures and creating ideal subjects, these rural development schemes, market expansion, market intensification, infrastructure development have really intensified territorialization, especially since the 1990s. And these enclosures are increasingly narrowing livelihood dynamics, livelihood options into more state-approved, state-controllable sort of pathways. So cash crops, for example, migration for wage labor, or even in country, there's state-approved factory works and economic zones that are constantly being purported as an option, but people are now not able to really engage in agriculture the way that they have in the past. And so there's this conception of a gateway crop that Mohanty and Milne introduced, which is this crop that basically is like a gateway drug, something that opens you up to addiction and doesn't really have any substitutes. But here, a gateway crop is this sort of crop that intensifies capitalist relations and reduces the alternative choices that one can use. It reduces their autonomy. So it becomes this financial addiction and integration. And that's a point that I want to continue into my last slide, which is I think that this was probably all along. And so there's a famous Ho Chi Minh quote based off of a Confucian quote that is, to reap a return in 10 years, cultivate trees, to reap a return in 100, cultivate people. And so while trees have been a massive investment, there's also a push to cultivate people. And I see them as two in the same of mixing of short and long-term goals of territorial expansion and subject making. And that, don't have to talk about that. And that is where I'll end today. So thank you.